Hi, a very good day to all of you. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar that will include a live edit of a research manuscript. My name is Rebecca, and I'm here on behalf of Editage. Um as some of you may know, Editage is the world's largest provider of scientific communication solutions. We cater to researchers, institutes, universities, hospitals, publishers, journals, as well as various other resellers that are present around the world. And our global team includes editors, trainers, research communicators, and publication experts with rich background and work experience. So that's just a little bit about Editage. We will move on. Before we move on to the live edit, I just wanted to introduce myself. So currently, I work as a senior manager and from the quality and customer experience team. My team and especially me, I focus on just the quality of editorial services that we provide to our corporate partnerships. Prior to this, I was part of the editorial team for about 6 years. I'm a trained BELS-certified editor, and as part of my previous role, I was also heading two editorial teams, and that allowed me to interact with editors around the world and work on research papers from authors that are present all over the world. That was just a little bit about me. So today's session is going to have three parts. We are going to start with the live edit first, and the live edit for the manuscript that we are going to be looking at today is slightly technical. So for the exercise, I've used slightly non-technical or slightly less technical examples. This part of the session is going to be interactive. I hope you guys use the chat feature to be, so that to interact with us. And after that, we will open up the session for question and answers. So during the session or the live edit, at any point, if you have any questions, please use the chat window on your right hand side to type in anything that you guys may want to ask, anything that's if you're facing any issues, or just about anything, just use the chat window. And my friend Aditi here will be monitoring that window, and she will let me know if there's anything. uh, Most of the questions that will be there, I will be checking only after the exercise session when we open up for the questions. So just hang on until then, and I will answer all of your questions. So we will, yeah, we will move on to the live edit. I hope my screen is visible and clear. Okay, if not, please use the chat window. Okay. So just a heads up for this particular session. As you can see, this is almost 2,900 words long. It's not actually possible to edit the whole paper in just an hour. So what we're going to do is basically do a rough edit and cover as much as possible in the time that we have. A thing to note is that this is just the rough edit. Typically, when you actually edit, you would have to do like 2 or 3 rounds of edits just to ensure that you're catching everything possible. So that's one. The second thing that I would like you guys to know is that when I am adding comments that are aimed at the author, right now for this session, I'm only going to be adding pointers and not draft the entire comment in the interest of time. So just those two things for you guys to remember. Okay, let's begin. I will read the sentence and I will edit on the go, and I will explain some of the changes as we edit. Okay, so let's begin. The sentence says hepatic resection for hepatocellular carcinoma is safe with good perioperative and long term oncologic outcomes. There is a paucity of data with regards to intermediate term outcomes, and they've given an example of one of the outcomes that they're referring to. So if I look at the first sentence, I can it's obvious that there is some data that is already available about perioperative and long-term oncological outcomes. um, However, the information on intermediate term outcomes is not as well reported. So I know for a fact that intermediate term outcomes is an established term, but if at all you're editing a paper, or where you've not really come across a term, it's always good to check on Google. So Google has quite a few results already, and I think Google Scholar will also have a decent bit of, yeah. It seems like an established term, so I'm not going to change that. But what I do notice is that there seems to be a contrast about what kind of information is available. This information is pretty well reported, but this information isn't. So there's no transition between the two sentences, which is why I will add a transition that indicates there's a contrast. However, there is possibly of data with regards to, I think this whole thing can just be replaced with on to make the sentence shorter. Now, and one thing that I tend to focus on when I am editing is just aiming to keep the sentences as concise as possible. Few reasons. When you're actually editing, a lot of the times you may end up increasing the word count of the text because of the editorial changes that you're making, and not everybody may be okay with that. So, and also journals. Most papers that we get tend to be they are for publication in journals, and journals have word count limits on the abstract, on the main text. Almost all journals have that, so it's always good to keep your text short. So and it also helps cover any additional words that have been added during the editing process. So I will be making changes that may not always be necessary from a language perspective, but maybe they may just help reduce the length of the sentence. So this whole thing I've just replaced it with on. It's a much concise version, and I think revising this to just data on these outcomes, I'm going to say remain stars. Data here is remain stars. So this reduces the number of words. Like this was about 11 words, and now this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words. So we've reduced those words, but over here we'll have to end up increasing this for readability. We'll have to end up revising this for readability. So they've given an example of intermediate term outcome. Over here, they're basically referring to mortality that happens after 90 days after the surgery, and 1 year within the surgery. So we'll say something like this: mortality beyond 90 days and within 1 year of surgery, in which in this case is hepatic resection. So this change is specifically made for readability. And then we go on to the next sentence, which reads, this paper studies. Now I want to revise this because it's not a paper that is studying, it was the authors who are studying this. So we can say we aimed to study the risk factors for within 1 year mortality after elective hepatic resection with curative intent in patients with hepatocellular carcinoma. Now, if at all you're not comfortable with using "we" at the start of a sentence, what you can also do is you can change the sentence like this: the risk factors for mortality after elective HR with curative intent in patients with hepatocellular carcinoma were studied. That's another way to revise this sentence if at all you're not comfortable with using "we." Uh, Personal pronouns. Few other things to note over here. Within 1 year mortality seems a little off, so we're going to look that up. So it's not really an established term as such. So I'm not sure if the authors have coined this term, or they want like, or if they wrote it like this because they were struggling to make the sentence concise but couldn't like had issues with just being able to phrase it. So over here, I'll basically be telling them that if this is a coined term, then they could revise this as, um, it will say something like risk factors for mortality within 1 year of elective HR, and then we can say hereafter referred to as uh, within 1 year mortality. That way, you're defining for the audience what exactly you are referring to by within 1 year mortality. And if this is not a coined term, then you would have to revise this as risk factors for mortality within 1 year of active HR. So we'll leave the option to the authors because I'm not 100% sure what exactly, like, what was their intention when they phrased this phrase like this. So we'll give the author the option to choose, and we can tell them that once they have decided what they want to retain, we can make those changes throughout the paper. So yeah, that. Another thing that I would change over here simply for a word, for reducing the word count, is this: patients with HCC, it's completely fine. I'm just revising this and making this a noun string for reducing the word count, because the rest of the changes have led to an increase in the word count over here. Now, when it comes to just referring to patients with certain kind of diseases, just be careful to use patient first language. So an example of the authors here did use patient first language, and I'll explain what that means in a bit. So this phrasing is considered a patient first language. So basically, you're saying patients with a certain condition or a disease, that's considered patient first language. What is not considered patient first language is, I'll have to use another example just to make it clearer, and I'll use diabetes as an example. If you say diabetic patients, or if you refer to patients as diabetics, this is not considered patient first language. Instead, you would have to say diabetes patients. Now, they do this because when you're referring to people as diabetic or diabetics, this kind of phrasing sort of tags the people with the disease, and that's not considered appropriate nowadays. Whereas this kind of phrasing, or patients with diabetes, is um, like here we are being considerate towards patients, and we're considering them to be people first rather than tagging them with the disease that they have or the condition that they have. So when you're making changes, just be careful when you're referring to patients so that you're using patient first language. So in this case, the author had used patient first language, but I made the change simply for reducing the word count. Okay. Then we'll move on to the method section. Um, okay. An audit of patients who underwent curative hepatic resection for HCC from this period to this period was conducted. Now you'll notice that audit over here is a noun form. We can actually reduce the length of a sentence when instead of a noun form, uh, we just use the verb form. So we can just say patients, instead of saying an audit was of so and so was conducted, you can just say so and so were audited. So that's the logic behind changing this. Now, another thing to note is that the patients themselves don't get audited. It's actually the data of patients that gets audited. So we're going to say that when to when. Yeah. And then we have univariate and multivariate analysis were sequentially performed. Now, analysis over here is singular, but it doesn't match the verb, so we're going to replace this with a plural form. Right. Now, what do we have? analysis was sequentially performed on perioperative variables using Fox regression analysis to identify factors that could predict that could predict intermediate term outcomes defined as within 1 year mortality. So I'm just marking this for something that I would have checked if I had to edit the entire text. I'm marking this because they've said outcomes, but they've only reported on one particular aspect. So later in the text, once I have more context from the method section, we would have to come back to this to query the author if they've actually like yeah, basically either to query the author for more clarity or to make any revisions based on the rest of the text, based on context that we've gotten from the rest of the text. And ideally, once we have clarity on this particular phrasing from the author, like what they whether this is a coin term or no, then we can revise this as well if needed. Otherwise, if this is a coin term, because we have already defined it for the audience earlier, we don't need to define it again here. Kaplan-Meier survival curves and hazard ratios were obtained. We then have 348 patients underwent hepatic resection during the study period, and 163 patients had curative hepatectomy for HCC. If you notice this sentence, it says patients had curative hepatectomy. Hepatectomy is a surgery. So the phrasing basically reads patients had surgery. Now, this kind of phrasing is actually pretty common in the literature, but it's not technically right because patients don't have the surgery, they undergo the surgery. So the right phrasing grammatically would be patients underwent, because it's in the past tense. So patients underwent curative hepatectomy for HCC. Now you'll notice that I placed a comma over here. That's because that's because this particular sentence is one complete sentence, and this part of the sentence is another complete sentence. So you basically have two complete sentences being united by a conjunction and. Now, when you have two complete sentences and you want to unite them, there are certain ways that you can do it. So the first way is, if you are using a conjunction in between, it has to be you have to have a comma before it, which is why I added the comma. If you don't want to use a conjunction, another way to do it is just remove the comma, use a semicolon, and connect the two sentences. That's one way to do it. Or you can just split the sentences completely into two. But if you're splitting the sentence over here, I don't prefer that, because the next sentence then starts with a numeral, and you should not include numerals at the start of a sentence. So if we have to retain the period over here, we would have to spell this out. So 100 underwent, or another option here could be of these 163 patients underwent curative hepatectomy for hepatocellular carcinoma. There are various ways of uniting these two complete sentences when you come across them in your paper. Then we have 15 patients died within 1 year of HR. The right phrasing when you're using within in this context is within duration of, not after. Multivariate analysis identified trial per class, BC, multinodularity, macrovascular invasion. I see that there's a comma missing here, post-operative acute renal failure, and post-hepatic liver failure as significant predictors of 1 year mortality. Few things over here: when you have different components, more than three components, three or more components, you have one, two, three, four, five being listed, it's always good to place a comma before the last component. I'll explain the use of this. So this particular comma is called an Oxford comma, or a series comma, or a serial comma. This is basically this comma is basically for just better clarity. like maybe the clarity is not very obvious here, but in some cases the comma plays a very crucial role. For example, we took when we went to the US, we uh, took a tea, a cook, and a maid. Now, in this sentence, uh, without the comma over here, it reads as if whoever went to the US, they took Betty, and Betty was the cook and the maid. But if the writer is actually trying to tell us that they took three people, then you would have to add this. Only when you add this is it obvious that they took Betty, they took a cook, and they took a maid. So this comma just basically helps in better clarity. So we recommend adding this just to ensure there is no ambiguity in any case for your reader. So which is why I've added this. Another thing to note over here is that this particular term, now hepatic means liver, and this basically reads like post liver failure, which doesn't make sense at all. So if we Google this, they're probably they're probably referring to post hepatectomy liver failure. So this is something that you know we can change, or we can ask the author. Technically, this is obvious that they're referring to post hepatectomy liver failure, so we would make the change directly as significant predictors of 1 year mortality. Now, another thing that we notice here is that till now they've been talking about within 1 year mortality, but here they're talking about 1 year mortality. So, just to ensure consistency in the term, we would query the author if this should be, within 1 year mortality over here. And another thing that you should note is that HR, which is used over here, is actually hepatic resection, but that's clearly not what the authors are referring to here. They're probably referring to the hazard ratios over here. So we would have to add this here. We'll have to define abbreviations at the start, at the first instance of use in the abstract and the main text. So I've done that here, but the problem with doing that here is that we already have another abbreviation that is exactly the same. So we'll definitely have to ask the author, we'll have to notify the author that we've defined it here because he's using this over here, but there's a duplication of the same of the abbreviation. We'll just have to tell the author just to bring it to his attention. And then we have the conclusion which says 1 year mortality, again 1 year mortality and not within 1 year. So that's something we need to flag. Following HR for HC remains high and can be predicted by these things. So I'm going to change this to was high because this is not a published study. I mean, if we were editing this, this is not published yet. Technically, this is a published paper, but because it's not an established fact, you can't use the present tense here. Because if you're doing a research and you're writing the conclusion of your study, in most fields you can't use the present tense. So you're reporting your results, in the past tense. So what you found was all of this was in the past tense. So was high. I'm going to say it. It could be predicted pre-operatively by multinodularity, child patlas, and macrovascular invasion. Post-operative acute renal failure and liver failure were associated with 1 year mortality. Again, term consistency issues over here. So another thing that I do want to flag for the author, and this is something that will be useful when you're writing your paper or editing, is just to do a check between the conclusion of the abstract and the aim of the abstract. And the same check you should do between the aim in your introduction and the conclusion of the main text. Basically, the kind of phrasing that you use in the aim should be aligned with the kind of phrasing that you're using in the conclusion. So we come across some cases where the study has like 2 or 3 aims, but the authors have only addressed few of those in when they're writing their conclusions. So ideally, if you're listing like three aims in your three aims, then your conclusion should address all three aims. So that's one thing. Now we know that here we have only one aim, and the authors have said that this paper, the aim is basically to identify, the risk factors. But over here, um, the phrasing that is there, while we do have the conclusion, they don't have a definite statement saying, the risk factors were found to be blah blah blah. So I mean, it's not a huge issue as such, but it's just, to uh, I think, just to make it like super clear for anybody who's reading it. I think that could be one suggestion that you could make for the author over here, just so that the phrasing is clear. Anybody reading it at one shot can just go to the aim, go to the conclusion. Okay, so this was the aim of the study, and this was what they found. They don't have to like read between the lines and try and figure out, oh, so what did they find them, did they not find them, what did they find, just so that it's super clear. Okay. Yeah, I don't think we have to make any changes to the keywords because they all are following a certain style and they seem to be fine. We move on to the background information. So before I do that, let me. Okay. So, yeah, hepatocellular carcinoma is the fifth most prevalent cancer worldwide and the third most frequent cause of cancer related death. Now, because worldwide is present over here and not at the end, it to me it reads as if only this information is, uh, uh, you know, it's like it feels like the worldwide applies only to this part of the sentence and doesn't apply to this part of the sentence. So if this applies to both, then ideally this should be here. But I'll definitely have to ask the author if that is true. So the comment over there. And then you have locally, HCC is the third and fourth most frequent cause of cancer related death among men and women, respectively. Now, nothing wrong with this sentence except that we don't know what country this refers to. This is these results are for. So you'll have to specifically say something like in, and then you'll have to mention the country. It's HCC is the third and fourth most frequent cause of cancer-related death. Due to the shortage of donor livers for liver transplant, hepatic resection is the first-line curative option and has low morbidity and mortality. Now, over here, the, the word transplant specifically refers to the tissues or the organ that is being, transplanted. But here they're specifically referring to the process. So we are going to use transplantation. And another change that I'm going to make is this. Now, when you have due to, just to ensure that you are using the right term, uh, you should know that due to is replaceable by caused by. And just to ensure that you're using due to the correct way, try and replace due to with caused by in the sentence and see if the sentence makes sense. So if we had to do that, this would be caused by the shortage of donor livers, hepatic resection is the first line curative option. It sounds a little off. So this is actually not the right term. What the authors actually mean is that because of the shortage of donor livers, hepatic resection is the first line curative option. So we can either use because of, or owing to. These two are synonymous and these two are synonymous. Now, because we already have two over here, I'm just going to say owing to the shortage of donor livers for liver transplantation. Hepatic resection is the first line curative option. Um, yeah, and perhaps we can say as it has low morbidity and mortality rates. However, recurrence rates remain high with an impact on delayed mortality. So, delayed mortality again is a term, proper term. But I think one recommendation for the authors would be, uh, it does say that recurrence rates, they have an impact on the delayed mortality, but just maybe specify what kind of impact it actually has. Like it increases, because otherwise you're saying that it has low morbidity and mortality rates, but here you're saying it has high, I'm assuming high delayed mortality. So can we actually say this? So maybe just clarify the, just specify the impact rather than just saying it has an impact. Maybe delayed mortality is typically higher, but maybe overall mortality rates are still lower than usual. We don't know. So just to clarify that. And we have tumor size and multinodularity are known predictors of early recurrence. Now, this sentence by itself is fine. If you are looking to reduce the word count, you can say tumor size and multinodularity are predictors of early recurrence. Now, this is already published, so it's fine to say this, uh, in the present tense, are predictors of early recurrence. You can also say unknown to be predictors of early recurrence. All of them are fine. Many units, including ours, have witnessed that 90-day mortality is significantly higher than 30-day mortality. So instead of saying witness, I think a better word choice would be have observed that 90-day mortality is significantly higher than 30-day mortality, leading to the underestimation of perioperative deaths, when using the traditional 30-day mortality as a key performance indicator of outcomes of resection. I think this is fine. Um, Over here, I added an article because they're specific about what is being underestimated. It's not mortality later; it's mortality. It's peri-operative mortality. So, since we're being very specific, I've added the article though over here. Short-term peri-operative outcomes report events up to 90 days. We don't need a hyphen over there. And this sentence is slightly, it's off. We also have long-term oncological outcomes universally report 1 year, 3 year, or 5 year disease-free survival or overall survival. Again, this sentence is also off. I think what the author is trying to say is, um, I think perhaps include short-term perioperative outcomes, include events up to 90 days of surgery or maybe even HR, um, and long-term outcomes, um, like basically these universally considered to be universally reported as long-term outcomes. So basically the sentence reads short-term. Okay, so because we have phrased a sentence like this can also be phrased like this: events up to 90 days are reported as short-term perioperative outcomes. Then you can say, whereas 1 year, 3 year, or 5 year disease-free survival or overall survival are universally reported as long-term outcomes. So we can edit both ways. We can give the author the option of choosing what he prefers. And thus, there is a hiatus in surgical oncology for reporting intermediate term outcomes after 90 days and before 12 months. Now, this word means pause or break, and this word does not make sense over here. This also has a sentence construction issue. I think what the author is trying to say, especially because we have background from the abstract, is that while events up to 90 days are considered short-term perioperative outcomes, and 1 year, 3 year, or 5 year disease-free survival or overall survival are reported as long-term outcomes. Um, Outcomes that events basically that happen after 90 days and within 1 year. Before 1 year, uh, there's a gap in, you know, yeah, there's just not much data about that. So we can tell the author that this was slightly unclear, and if they mean that data on intermediate term outcomes, and we can put all of this within, as an example over here, 90 days, and just for consistency in how they've been representing this till now. In 1 year, because they specifically said surgical oncology, I can say oncological surgery, specifically referring to surgery for cancer. Data on remaining scars. Yeah, that's what they were trying to say. And then they move on to say in colon cancer patients, reports found underestimation. Now it says reports, but they've only cited one study. So should this be study reported, because they've only cited one study, or if they want to retain the plural form, then they'll have to cite more studies over here. Um, uh, I actually prefer this version. A study reported the underestimation of 1 year mortality and identified post-operative complications, emergency resection, and comorbidities as its risk factors. I assume the risk factors they're talking about is for the 1 year mortality. Age, future liver remnant. Again, this is a specific term. Yeah, it's a specific term. And hepatic insufficiency are associated with 90-day mortality risk following HR. Now, this is not best phrasing. They're basically talking about the risk of death following surgery, so we'll have to phrase it like that, with associated with the risk of 90-day mortality following HR. Beyond 90-day mortality in HR is poorly studied and reported. This is fine. In addition to tumor biology, early recurrence or treatment related complications, impact, impact beyond 90-day mortality outcomes. I prefer saying mortality related outcomes over here. Identification of mortality predictors within the first year post hepatectomy. I prefer saying predictors of mortality within 1 year, because that's how they've been phrasing it all this time. Within 1 year of hepatectomy, would aid in clinical decision making, in particular when considering. So, in particular is fine, but I'm changing it just to reduce one word over here, particularly when considering less invasive treatment options and alternative strategies to hepatic resection with lower morbidity risk, as well as in patient enrollment into clinical trials. Radio frequency ablation with transarterial chemoembolization has been studied and reported. Now, I can just remove this whole thing, because if it has been reported, it means it has been studied, has been reported to have equivalent oncological outcomes compared with HR. So I'm going to say has been reported to have oncological outcomes equivalent to those of hepatic resection. Because for better phrasing, a propensity score matched analysis of 154 HCC patients with single tumors by the et al. reported no noticeable difference in local tumor progression, intrahepatic distance recurrence, disease-free survival, and overall survival uh, when comparing hepatic resection with this therapy. So this is largely fine for now. Um, yeah, a recent meta-analysis by these authors also concludes that I can see an extra space over here that this combination therapy is associated with lower morbidity compared with surgery. Now, because you've said lower, lower is the second degree of comparison. So you have three degrees of comparison. You have low, lower, lowest. Now, when you have the second degree of comparison being used, the term that is used to compare is than. So it's associated with lower morbidity than surgery with comparable oncological outcomes. So I've specifically added this comma over here because it's not that they're comparing this combination therapy with surgery that has specific oncological outcomes. What they actually mean to say is that this combination therapy has lower morbidity than surgery in general, and while morbidity is lower, the other outcomes are comparable between the two. So which is why we need to sort of set that off with a comment, with a comma over here. Hence, in addition to 90-day mortality risk predictors, uh, there's knowledge of predictors within within 1 year mortality. So this is predictors of within 1 year mortality is vital, as this could impact treatment recommendations, patient quality of life, and patient choice. Our study aims to identify um, all factors predicting mortality within the first year for patients undergoing. Okay. If I have to revise this just to make the phrasing consistent with how it's used in the rest of the text, within 1 year of HR, perhaps curative HR, yeah. So I think we have about 15 minutes to go. So, and I'm not sure we'll be able to cover the entire method section, or maybe we can. Maybe we can. We'll just quickly do a rough edit of the method section as well. This is a retrospective audit of patients operated, we can just say, who underwent HR at a university affiliated hospital from blah blah blah. Survival data of all patients, we don't need the over here. Survival data of all patients were obtained prospectively until this date. Patients included, we can just say, he included patients who underwent curative open or laparoscopic surgery for HCC. Patients with cholangiocarcinoma and metastatic liver nodules were excluded. All patients were discussed. Say all cases, maybe. I don't know. I'll have to check this. I'll have to check what is preferable in this case. All patients were discussed at the multidisciplinary tumor board meeting prior to surgery. Anesthetist assessed every patient preoperatively at the pre-admissions counseling and evaluation clinic. Non-surgical treatment modalities were offered for patients deemed unfit by the operating surgeon or those with a high cardiovascular risk as adjudged by an anaerobic threshold of value. Since we don't have much time, I will check this term, the use of this term in this particular context. So I've just put a comment for me to check this at a later stage by an anaerobic threshold of so and so and ICG risk retention. I don't see ICG being used elsewhere, so we'll have to check for the full form, and if it's commonly available, we'll have to use the full form here. Retention value of so and so at 15 minutes precludes major HR. So This bit is slightly technical, so this is something that I would have to look up later. An institute offers liver-directed chemo and radioembolization as well as local thermal ablative therapies for suitable patients. So this phrase I'll have to probably also confirm because of the way it's phrased. The meaning is clear, but just to confirm, I'm adding a comment for myself to check later. The HPP consensus guidelines. This again needs a full form here. Were used to recognize those with satisfactory FLR. FLR, I think, has been defined earlier, future liver remnant, so we don't need to define this here. The Brisbane 2000 classification was used to define the types of resection. If you're trying to reduce the word count, you can do this and make a noun string to reduce. Yeah. One word here. Only minor resections were offered to child class B, C patients. Choice of technique, open versus was left to the individual surgeon. Okay. Intraoperative findings and postoperative complications were recorded. R1 resection indicates a histological positive margin with tumor cells within 1 millimeter from the margin. The presence of any combined cases were excluded. We can actually just say combined HCC cholangiocarcinoma cases were excluded. Post hepatectomy liver failure, uh, yeah, were utilized as per their original definitions. So, again, this is sort of clear, but the way the authors have, like, clear in the sense the meaning is clear, but the way the authors have written it is slightly may not may not. I think they're trying to be very concise, but for somebody who does not maybe is not too familiar with liver failure or hepatectomy may not immediately identify what they're trying to say. So I think they meant that this kind of liver failure was classified in 3 grades, and we had criteria that were used. So again, we'll have to look this up to understand how best to see if this is how it's best represented or if there's a way to improve this. Length of stay was calculated from the date of surgery to discharge date, both dates inclusive. Following discharge, patients were followed up with a physical examination, liver function test, alpha fetoprotein. I don't know if this is used again. It's not. So we can just remove this. Tests and compute yeah, CTs and at regular intervals of 3 to 4 months for the first year and 4 to 6 months thereafter. If at all you're trying to reduce the number of words, you can use either a hyphen or even preferable, it's an you can use an hyphen here to move it. You can find it. Okay, I'm not able to find the n hyphen, but it's okay. There's a K-pop band that shows up instead, but um most journals will be okay with a hyphen, so you can use a hyphen over here, first year, and this within 1 year modality is defined. It's going to be was defined because this is the methods of your study. It's not yet published, so you would have to talk about it in the past tense. Was defined as all cause mortality within 12 months of the date of data. You can also say 1 year just for maintaining consistency with the rest of the uh, text. Then all cause mortality is a proper term. The statistics quantitative data were expressed as medium and range, while the qualitative data were expressed as yeah, this phenomenal data. Chi-square, Fisher's exact test was performed. Date metric data were analyzed using this test. Variables with p-values of less than 0.5 in the univariate analysis were entered for multivariate analysis with this model. Statistical analysis, significance was defined as p-values of less than 0.05. Kaplan survival curves were generated for the pre, inter, and post-operative independent risk factors from multivariate analysis. All analyses were, just for better word choice, performed using this. I think we are running short of time, so I'm going to stop with the live edit over here, and we will move on to the examples. So, okay, no questions thus far. Uh, so what we're going to do is I have some examples, and what you guys can do is basically try and identify what errors are present in these sentences. Like, they seem fine, but there's something that can be improved or something that is incorrect in these examples. So type your answer in the chat box. We'll take about a minute for you guys to just go over this and type your answers, and then we will discuss what were the issues in these four sentences. So yeah, you can take about a minute now. Okay, so Mrinmai says use the symbol percent and use numericals. So for this particular sentence, I don't think we can use the percent symbol over here because 98 is spelled out. So had 98 not been spelled out, then we can use the percent symbol. But because it is spelled out, we can't. We'll have to spell out percent as well. But you're right. One thing that we can change over here is that 17 and 25 can be numerals because they are greater than 10. So yeah, thanks Manmai for the answer. Yes, that's one error for sure. But there's another problem that is there with this sentence. If you are able to identify, that's great. Anyone? Anyone else wants to guess what is the problem with this sentence? So 17 out of 25 is not 98%. So there's a technical error over here, which is why we'll have to. So this kind of errors you can actually see when, especially in the results section or in the tables, your values don't really add up. So if you are somebody who's writing the paper, just ensure that all your values add up. When you're listing, say, your sample size, or listing, like, what happened to certain groups of people, ensure that your numbers all add up. So that's one thing that you can just one thing to note when you're writing the paper. And if you are editing, and if this is within, checking for these kind of errors is within the scope of the service that you're editing for, this is something that you can watch out for. Okay. Use students in my class instead of my students. Use number 17 only. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, use students in my class instead of my students. Okay, okay. So I think I got what you're trying to say. I think you're saying that replace this. So I think that depends on the kind of paper. So this is a pretty non-technical example. So maybe in this context, it's okay to say my students, but maybe in another case, in another scenario, depending on the context, that could be incorrect. Correct. Mark was right. Here it says section 4, whereas here it says fifth section. So there's an inconsistency in how we are talking about the section. So either we replace this and change this to fourth section, or we change this to section 5. Thank you. Correct. Right. Anybody else who could, or anyone who wants to try and see what could be changed over here? Okay, so over here we have to some extent and we have partially. In this case, there is a redundancy here because both of these phrases and words both talk about the same thing. So we can just say the ethanolic extract partially arrested the cell cycle because partially conveys to some extent anyway. So that's how we can revise this particular sentence. The last example reads fine. uh, I think two things that we have two things that can be revised in this particular sentence is all over the globe. If you are looking to reduce the length of a sentence, you can just say worldwide. So breast cancer has been increasing worldwide. Now that's not an error, that's an enhancement. However, over here, there is something that we need to address. So it says breast cancer has been increasing. Now, we don't know what about breast cancer has been increasing. Is it the incidence? Is it the prevalence? Is it the risk of breast cancer? Is it the severity of the condition? We don't know what the author is specifically referring to. And these kind of things can get very, we need clarity on these things, especially when you're talking about, say, a condition in an epidemiology paper. So I think this is something that we would have to ask the author about, like what about breast cancer is he saying is increasing around the world. So yeah, right, use worldwide instead. Thanks, Munmai. Which comes first, presentation or analysis? Right, I think they are. Right, we can also use globally. That's another concise way to say worldwide or all over the globe. That's correct. um, yeah, I think over here again, um, I think what the authors were trying to say for this particular part is that they are showing their findings in that section, in section 4, and then they've sort of presented their analysis in the fifth section. So it's just a play on words over here. Yeah. Okay, so we'll move on to the next. So there was a technical error over here. It does not come up to 98 percent. And like we said, there's a consistency issue here, a redundancy issue here, and readability and clarity issue here. Now the next one, we've already exceeded our time, but we'll so maybe I will just explain what the issue is with these sentences. So he has an extremely friendly disposition, is unconnected to politics, and he is a scientist who is fond of experiments. The problem here is that he has, is, and he is. All three components are very non-parallel. So we'll have to revise this in a way where it is like it's there is parallelism in this sentence. So we can say something like he. Either we can say he has an extremely friendly disposition, he is unconnected with politics, and he is a scientist who is fond of experiments. That way, the he is applicable to all appropriately. Or we would have to say he is an extremely friendly person, is unconnected with politics, and is a scientist who is fond of experiments. So we use is everywhere for all three components. So that's one way to make this sentence parallel. Um, in the second example, we have competition is intense among certain professionals, such as medicine. The problem with this example is that professionals and medicine don't match. Medicine is not a professional, it's perhaps a field but not a professional. So I think we come across these kind of errors when we edit papers, where we are listing the examples of a parameter. So sometimes we see sentences like diseases such as tuberculosis, cancer, diabetes, HIV, etc. Now, the problem with this is that HIV is not a disease, it's a virus. So if you're listing examples of a certain parameter, just ensure that all of your examples that you've listed are actually, they apply to the parameter that you're discussing at that point. So that's something you need to take care of. And over here, this it says the stress of preparing for the Olympics is worse than a wedding. Now, the problem with this sentence is a comparison. The comparison is weird. The stress is compared to a wedding. So it's incorrect comparison. You have to compare the uh, stress with the stress. We can't compare stress with a wedding. So you have to say the stress of preparing for the Olympics is worse than the stress of preparing for a wedding. That's how you would revise this. So these kind of comparison errors happen very often in the results section when you're listing the results of different groups. So often it would we come across sentences like levels in group B were lower than group A. Now the meaning is sort of obvious from the sentence. Anybody who's reading it would know what the author is talking about, but grammatically it's incorrect. So you would have to say levels in group B were lower than the levels in group A. So something of that sort. Yeah. So he is extremely friendly, unconnected with politics, and a scientist who is fond of experiments. The he is applies to this component, it applies to this, and it applies to this. So that's how we make the sentence parallel. And yeah, here the examples don't match the item that they are supposed to, that they've listed for. So yeah, those were some common errors. We'll now move on to the question and answer uh, session. So in the meantime, while we look at the question and answer, while we check the questions that you guys would have added over here in the chat box. uh, Aditi has left the feedback form in the chat box as well. Please fill the feedback form and give your suggestions, give stuff that you would like us to do or not like us to do as well. We definitely check all the feedback and take next steps based on them. So yeah, let me just go through the chat box to see any questions. It doesn't seem like anybody has had it doesn't seem like anybody has added any questions. um, okay, if you can't think of any questions right now, we are open for questions. If you have them, you can add them right now in the chat box or in the question answer panel. If you can't think of any questions right away, please feel free to write into us, and we will get back to you. doesn't seem like anybody is. I think we can end the session now then. Okay. Do complete the feedback form. Thank you so much for being an interactive audience. This was an honor to do. Uh, yeah, I hope you guys have a good day. Thank you.